As I sat by the washing machine, staring at the mountain of laundry that seemed to grow taller by the second, an odd sense of calm settled over me. It was one of those mundane days where nothing out of the ordinary happened, just the usual chores, the familiar hum of the machine, and the kind of quiet that made time drag on forever. The steady rhythm of the washer was almost soothing, lulling me into a kind of trance as my mind wandered. I was caught up in the simplicity of it all, reaching for another pile of clothes to toss in, when the door to the laundry room swung open. In walked my nephew, Caleb. His sudden appearance broke the stillness like a crack of thunder. He wasn't the little kid I remembered anymore. Over the past few months, he'd shot up, his once small frame now filled out, his presence commanding in a way that was hard to ignore. There was a new confidence in the way he carried himself, like the boy I used to know had been replaced by this self-assured young man. I didn't think much of it at first, though. My words came out almost without thinking as I glanced up from the laundry. "Why don't you give me a hand with this? You might as well learn how to do it." It was meant to be a light-hearted suggestion, something to keep him busy, but the moment the words left my mouth, I noticed something in his eyes. His gaze didn't just flicker over me like it usually did, it locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach twist. For a split second, I felt something shift in the air, something I couldn't quite put into words. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was nothing, but there was no denying the tension that had settled between us. It hung there, heavy and unspoken, like the quiet before a storm. After what felt like an eternity, Caleb shrugged, his movements casual, but the energy in the room was anything but. "Sure, why not?" he said, his voice deeper than I remembered, smooth and steady in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned away quickly, my cheeks burning for reasons I couldn't explain. It was just laundry, after all. Nothing to get worked up about. Or so I told myself. We started working together, falling into a rhythm that came naturally after years of being around each other. He handed me clothes one by one, and I tossed them into the machine. It was simple, mechanical, but with every movement, something changed. Every time our hands brushed, accidentally at first, then lingering just a little too long, I felt a spark, a jolt of electricity that left me breathless. It wasn't just the closeness, it was the way he moved, the way he seemed to close the distance between us with every passing second. His presence was overwhelming, impossible to ignore. I tried to focus on the task, to shake off the strange pull I felt toward him, but it was no use. My mind was elsewhere, caught up in the tension that was building between us. The room felt warmer, the air heavier, and I couldn't tell if it was the heat from the washing machine or the heat rising between us. My throat went dry, and I found myself avoiding his gaze, afraid of what I might see, or feel, if I looked too long. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the silence between us became unbearable. This wasn't about laundry anymore. Something else was happening, something unspoken and dangerous, and it was getting harder to ignore. The attraction, the chemistry, it was undeniable, and it was growing with every glance, every touch. Then, as if everything had been leading to this moment, his hand brushed mine again. But this time, it wasn't an accident. His fingers lingered against mine, deliberate and intentional, and my breath hitched in my throat. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and there was no mistaking what I saw there. His eyes were dark, filled with something I couldn't name, something that pulled me in with a force I wasn't prepared for. He stepped closer, so close that I could feel the heat radiating off his body, the space between us almost non-existent. I should have moved away, should have put some distance between us to break whatever spell had fallen over the room. But I didn't. I stood frozen, unable to do anything but wait, my heart pounding in my chest. Neither of us spoke. The silence was thick with everything we hadn't said, everything we didn't dare say out loud. And in that silence, everything hung in the balance. His hand reached for mine again, this time with a purpose that sent a jolt of electricity racing through me. His fingers closed around mine, firm yet gentle, and I felt my breath catch. The air was suddenly too thick, too heavy to breathe. I knew this wasn't right. I knew it couldn't be. But even as the thought flickered through my mind, everything else faded away, the room, the laundry, the world outside. None of it mattered. It was just us, standing on the edge of something irreversible, something that would change everything. He stepped closer, his body just inches from mine, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. I could feel his breath on my skin, sending a shiver through my entire body. My heart raced, and I knew I should stop him, should say something to pull us back from the edge. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt the magnetic pull between us grow stronger, overwhelming every rational thought. Before I could even process what was happening, his lips brushed against mine, soft, tentative, like he was testing the waters. He gave me one last chance to step back, to stop whatever this was before it spiraled completely out of control. But I couldn't pull away. I didn't want to. Instead, I leaned into the kiss, my hands reaching for him, pulling him closer as if my body had already decided long before my mind could catch up. The kiss deepened, and with it, everything that had been simmering between us, every unspoken word, every hidden desire, exploded in that single moment. It was intoxicating, like drowning in something both terrifying and beautiful. His lips moved against mine with a slow, deliberate urgency, and I could feel his hands exploring, tracing the curves of my skin as if he was trying to memorize every inch of me. Every touch, every caress sent electric shocks racing down my spine. We'd crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed, but in that moment, the idea of turning back felt almost laughable. Nothing else mattered except him, except the way he made me feel. And from the way he held me, the way he kissed me, it seemed like he felt the same. We broke apart for a second, our breathing heavy and ragged, our foreheads pressed together as we tried to catch our breath. The air between us was thick with tension, with longing, and yet there wasn't a trace of regret in me. No guilt, no shame, just this aching, burning desire to keep going. His hands slid down my arms, his touch lingering even through the fabric of my clothes, sending sparks through my skin. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, but my body knew exactly what it wanted. It wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about this. Without a word, without hesitation, he pulled me in again, his lips finding mine with an intensity that left me breathless. This kiss was different, urgent, desperate, like we both knew this was the point of no return, and neither of us had the strength to stop it. My hands tangled in his hair, my body pressing against his, wanting to be as close as possible, as if I could melt into him and make this moment last forever. Every nerve in my body was on fire, and I could feel the same heat burning in him. The pull between us, the chemistry that had been building for so long, had finally erupted into something neither of us could deny. As the kisses grew more frantic, the urgency between us surged. My mind screamed at me to stop, to think about what we were doing, but my body refused to listen. Every instinct I had was screaming for more, for him. And the deeper I sank into this moment, the more impossible it seemed to stop. The tension was electric, a current thrumming between us, wrapping around us, tightening with every movement, every kiss. We stumbled backward, our bodies colliding with the washing machine behind us, and I gasped softly, my breath hitching as his hands roamed across my body. The hum of the laundry machine still filled the room, but it felt distant now, almost irrelevant, swallowed up by the storm we were creating. In that moment, nothing else existed. No consequences, no rules, no right or wrong, just the undeniable connection between us, the unspoken bond we'd been fighting to ignore. And yet, pulling away felt impossible. Everything in me, in him, seemed to demand this moment, this reckoning with what had always been simmering beneath the surface. There was no turning back now. The floodgates had been thrown wide open, and the intensity between us built to a fever pitch. I found myself surrendering completely to the moment. Every doubt, every hesitation, every question that had once cluttered my mind dissolved into the air. In that instant, there was only him, and the way his presence consumed me. His touch was electric, sending tremors of pleasure through my entire body. It was a sensation unlike anything I'd ever felt before, raw and intense, almost otherworldly. I wasn't sure I'd ever experience anything like it again. But deep down, I knew this moment couldn't last forever. Eventually, the mundane realities of life would intrude. The laundry would need to be folded, the world would keep spinning, and we'd have to face the truth of what had just happened. Yet, for now, I pushed all those thoughts aside, embracing the passion fully as we moved together. Everything outside of us began to fade into oblivion. The world blurred, as if time itself had stopped. All that existed, all that mattered, was the incredible way he made me feel, his hands on my skin, the heat of his lips against mine, the rhythm of his body moving with mine. It was intoxicating, exhilarating, and utterly consuming. It felt like freedom and surrender all at once, and I was lost in it, in him, in everything that had come to be between us. I didn't want it to end. I couldn't bear the thought of it slipping away. Eventually, the moment began to shift, slowly but inevitably. We pulled apart, breathless and disoriented, our hearts still hammering wildly in our chests. The room, which had been filled with the sound of our shared breaths and racing pulses, fell silent. The washing machine had finished its cycle, leaving only the quiet hum of the world outside. And with that stillness came the slow, creeping return of reality. The weight of everything that had just happened began to settle around us like a heavy fog. I looked at him, searching his eyes for something, anything, that would tell me what this meant, what we were supposed to do next. But before I could find the words to break the silence, he reached for my hand, his grip gentle but firm. His eyes, still shining with that same fire, held mine for a long moment. Then, in a voice as steady as it was soothing, he spoke softly, "We'll figure this out." There was an assurance in his words, a quiet confidence that wrapped around me like a promise. And in that instant, I knew that no matter what came next, no matter the consequences of what we just shared, we'd face it together. The future was uncertain, undefined, but one thing was clear: the bond we'd forged in this unspoken, untamed moment was real. It was undeniable. And it was ours. As we stood there, side by side, the weight of the moment pressing in, I couldn't help but wonder what the next chapter of our story would be. The future was a vast unknown, filled with both fear and excitement. The uncertainty of what lay ahead was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. But there was a sense of clarity, too. One thing was certain: we'd face whatever came next together. No matter the twists and turns in our path, we'd crossed a line, one that had irrevocably changed everything. But it was a line we'd crossed together. And now, there was no going back. Whatever happened next, we'd face it hand in hand. And that thought, more than anything, filled me with anticipation and excitement.